first transmission arrived on a Tuesday at 14:37 Grand GM, intercepted simultaneously by radio telescopes across 6 continents. Unlike the dramatic scenarios envisioned by science fiction writers, there were no massive ships blotting out the sun, no Independence Day-style ultimatums, no cryptic mathematical sequences. Instead, humanity received something far more unsettling: a desperate plea for help, broadcast in broken English that had clearly been learned from intercepted Earth transmissions. We are dying. Our ships failing. We tried to be strong like your stories say, but we cannot do this alone anymore. We are the HFY. We ask for your help. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead xenolinguist at the Arecibo Observatory's successor facility, would later describe that moment as the end of every assumption we'd ever made about first contact. Within hours, the message had been verified, triangulated, and confirmed as originating from a source approximately 0.3 light-years from Earth, impossibly close for an interstellar civilization and moving closer. The world's governments, for once, managed to coordinate their response with unprecedented efficiency. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in that first message, or perhaps it was the simple fact that humanity had finally encountered something that made their terrestrial differences seem insignificantly small. Within 72 hours, a joint response was broadcast from the combined arrays of Earth's most powerful transmitters, HFY vessels. This is Earth. We have received your message. Tell us what you need. We are listening. The response came faster than the speed of light should have allowed, a detail that would later prove crucial to understanding HFY technology. The transmission was longer this time, interspersed with what could only be described as the alien equivalent of sobbing. We were a proud people. We conquered 12 worlds. We built cities that touched the stars, but we grew weak in our success. When the Devourers came, we thought we could fight as we always had. Alone, strong, independent. We were wrong. Our civilization, gone. Only 17 ships remain. 6,847 souls. We have been running for 37 of your years. Our ships fail. Our people grow sick. Our young ones die. We heard your transmissions, your stories of cooperation, of helping the weak. We do not understand this, but we are desperate. Will you teach us what we do not know? Dr. James Morrison, the UN Secretary-General's Special Advisor on Extraterrestrial Affairs, a position created exactly 73 hours earlier, later described his reaction: "Dear Benedicta, I remember thinking, they're not coming to conquer us, they're coming to learn from us." It changed everything about how we prepared for contact. The HFY ships became visible to Earth telescopes on day 7 of the communication exchange. They were magnificent even in their apparent decay. Sleek vessels that seemed to bend light around their hulls, clearly the product of a technology far beyond human capability. But even through the distortion of distance, the signs of damage were obvious. Hull breaches sealed with what appeared to be crystalline growths, irregular energy signatures suggesting failing power systems, and a flight pattern that spoke of vessels barely maintaining formation. By this time, humanity had learned much about their unexpected visitors. The HFY had evolved on a high-gravity world with scarce resources, developing a civilization built on principles of individual strength, technological superiority, and hierarchical dominance. For millennia, they had expanded through the galaxy not through cooperation or trade, but through conquest and assimilation. They were, by their own admission, very good at it, until they encountered the Devourers. The HFY never fully explained what the Devourers were, whether they were another species, an artificial intelligence, or something else entirely. What became clear was that the Devourers represented everything the HFY had thought themselves superior to: a collective intelligence that grew stronger through unity, that turned the HFY's individualistic society against itself, that consumed not just worlds but the very concept of independence that the HFY held sacred. "We fought them for 6 of your years," came one transmission. "Each time we met them in battle, they learned our tactics. They turned our strength against us. They made us weak by forcing us to remain strong, alone. We do not understand this. Your species broadcasts stories of working together, of sacrificing for others, of finding strength in weakness. We do not have words for this concept, but we must learn, or we will all die." The debate that raged across Earth's governments, academic institutions, and public forums was unlike anything in human history. Humanity was being asked to aid a species that had, by their own admission, built their civilization on conquest and subjugation. Yet they were also being asked to help refugees, beings whose entire world had been destroyed, whose children were dying, whose culture faced extinction. Dr. Elena Vasquez, professor of xenopsychology at Cambridge, another newly created position, argued persuasively for assistance. They're not asking us to help them rebuild their empire. They're asking us to teach them concepts that are fundamentally foreign to their psychology. They've looked at humanity and identified something we have that they lack. Not technology, not physical strength, but social cooperation. They want to learn how to be weak together instead of strong alone. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly unanimous. Earth would help. The first human ships launched within 2 weeks of first contact. They were hastily retrofitted scientific vessels loaded with medical supplies, food synthesis equipment, and most importantly, teams of sociologists, psychologists, and cultural anthropologists. The mission brief was unlike any in human history: teach an alien species how to cooperate. Commander Lisa Park, leader of the first contact team, described the moment when the human vessels docked with the lead HFY ship. We expected something grand, imposing. What we found was a species on the brink of collapse, holding on to their dignity by threads they were too proud to acknowledge were breaking. The HFY were tall, angular beings with an ethereal quality that suggested they might once have been breathtakingly beautiful. Their skin had a crystalline quality that reflected light in complex patterns, and their movements possessed a natural grace that spoke of high-gravity world evolution. But malnutrition and stress had dulled their natural radiance, and many showed signs of what human observers could only describe as severe depression. Their ships, magnificent as they appeared from the outside, revealed the toll of 37 years of flight. Advanced as their technology was, it had been designed for maintenance by large crews with specialized knowledge. As their numbers dwindled and their educational systems collapsed, their ability to maintain their vessels had degraded catastrophically. They were flying in technological marvels they could barely keep operational, sustained only by automated systems they no longer fully understood. The first cultural exchange sessions were exercises in mutual incomprehension. Human concepts of sharing resources, collective decision-making, and mutual support were not merely foreign to the HFY. They were antithetical to psychological patterns that had been reinforced over millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of civilization. We tried to explain democratic voting, reported Dr. Sarah Kim, the mission's lead cultural liaison. Their response was to ask who would be in charge of making the others obey the decision. When we explained that everyone would voluntarily follow the majority decision, they asked what would happen to the weak-minded individuals who couldn't make good decisions for themselves. The concept that those individuals might have valuable input that could improve the final decision it literally didn't translate. Their language had no framework for it. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week of direct contact, triggered by a crisis that nearly ended the cultural exchange before it began. A cascade failure in the life support systems of one of the smaller HFY vessels left 127 beings without breathable atmosphere. In HFY tradition, the strong would be evacuated first, followed by those of genetic or intellectual value, with the remainder left to die as a regrettable but necessary sacrifice to ensure species survival. The human response was immediate and instinctive. Every available human vessel altered course to assist in evacuation, with no consideration given to the relative value of those being rescued. When HFY ship commanders asked for the rescue priority protocols, the human response was simple: everyone, we save everyone. The look in their eyes, Commander Park later wrote in her mission report, was like watching someone see color for the first time. They couldn't understand why we would risk our own safety for beings we'd never met, who had no value to our species, who couldn't contribute to our survival. But they also couldn't understand why we seemed to think the question itself was strange. The successful evacuation of all 127 HFY from the failing vessel marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how the aliens viewed human society. For the first time, they had witnessed cooperation that strengthened rather than weakened the group, had seen individuals risk themselves for others with no expectation of reciprocal benefit. But understanding the concept intellectually was far different from internalizing it emotionally. The HFY had evolved as apex predators on a world where resources were scarce and competition was fierce. Millions of years of evolution had wired them to view cooperation as a strategy of the weak. a temporary measure adopted by those too inadequate to survive on their own merit. Dr. Michael Torres, the mission's evolutionary psychologist, noted in his reports, "They kept asking us when we were going to revert to our true nature and start competing with each other. They couldn't believe that human cooperation wasn't a temporary aberration brought on by unusual circumstances. They were waiting for us to become properly selfish and individualistic once the crisis passed." The process of teaching cooperation to a species that had evolved without it proved to be one of the most complex psychological challenges humanity had ever undertaken. It required not just intellectual understanding, but a fundamental rewiring of emotional responses that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of culture. The first successful HFY cooperation exercise was almost comically simple, teaching them to share food preparation duties. In traditional HFY society, food was prepared by the lowest status individuals and distributed according to strict hierarchies. The concept of high-status individuals willingly participating in food preparation was so foreign that many HFY initially assumed it was some form of punishment or degradation ritual. "We had to start with children," reported Dr. Tab. Jennifer Walsh, the mission's child psychologist. "Adult HFY psychological patterns were too firmly established, but their young ones, especially those born during the flight, hadn't yet fully internalized the hierarchical competition patterns. We could teach them to play cooperative games, to share resources voluntarily, to find joy in helping others succeed." The sight of young HFY teaching their parents human cooperation techniques became one of the most powerful catalysts for cultural change within the refugee fleet. Parents who had been skeptical of human methods found themselves unable to deny the evidence when their children demonstrated improved problem-solving abilities, better emotional regulation, and higher levels of what could only be described as happiness. But the transformation was not without its costs. Many older HFY struggled with what they perceived as a fundamental corruption of their nature. Suicide rates among adult HFY increased dramatically during the first months of cultural exchange, as individuals who had defined themselves through competitive achievement found themselves unable to adapt to cooperative paradigms. They would tell us they'd rather die as true HFY than live as false humans, Dr. Torres reported. "We had to develop entirely new therapeutic approaches to help them understand that adopting cooperation didn't mean abandoning their identity. It took months to convince them that they could be both HFY and cooperative." The transformation accelerated when the first mixed human HFY technical teams began working together to repair the failing alien vessels. Human engineers, working alongside HFY who possessed superior theoretical knowledge but had forgotten the practical application of their own technology, achieved maintenance miracles that neither species could have accomplished alone. For the HFY, it was a revelation. They had spent 37 years watching their ships slowly fail, each breakdown bringing them closer to extinction. Within weeks of beginning cooperation with human teams, not only were they preventing further degradation, but actually improving system performance beyond original specifications. The moment when they realized that human weakness made them stronger was transformative, reported Chief Engineer Patricia Delacroix. "You could see it in their body language, in their skin patterns. They went from viewing us as primitives offering charity to seeing us as partners offering mutual benefit." As the first part of this unprecedented cultural exchange drew to a close, both species had been fundamentally changed. Humanity had encountered their first alien civilization and discovered that their greatest strength lay not in technology or military power, but in their capacity for empathy and cooperation. The HFY had learned that survival might depend not on being the strongest, but on being willing to be vulnerable enough to accept help and offer it in return. Neither species could have anticipated how these lessons would be tested when the Devourers finally caught up with the HFY fleet. Part 2. The Test of Unity. The Devourers arrived without warning on day 73 of human HFY cooperation. There were no dramatic entrance effects, no massive fleets decanting from hyperspace. The first sign of their presence was simply the sudden silence of 2 HFY vessels on the fleet's perimeter. Communications cut off mid-transmission, life signs vanishing from sensors, the ships themselves continuing on trajectory as empty hulks. Commander Park's immediate response demonstrated how much human HFY cooperation had evolved in just 10 weeks. Rather than following traditional protocols that would have had human vessels withdrawing to safe distances while the HFY dealt with their own problem, the combined fleet immediately implemented Cooperative Defense Protocol 7, a hybrid strategy developed jointly by human tactical specialists and HFY military theorists. We'd spent weeks teaching them that strength came from working together, Park later testified before the UN Security Council. Now we were about to find out if we'd taught them well enough to survive their worst nightmare. The Devourers, when they finally revealed themselves, defied every expectation both species had developed. They were not the massive dreadnoughts that Kethvar battle records suggested, nor the insectoid swarms that human science fiction had imagined. Instead, they appeared as a shifting, adaptive network of vessels that seemed to reconfigure themselves in real time based on the opposition they faced. Dr. Sarah Chen, monitoring communications from the human flagship, recorded the first clear transmission from the Devourer collective. Kethvar, you have infected yourselves with cooperative weakness. This is acceptable. Weakness makes consumption more efficient. You will be processed. The contaminating elements will be isolated and studied. The casual dismissal in that transmission, the implication that humanity was merely a contaminating element to be studied, revealed the fundamental miscalculation that the Devourers had made. They had spent 37 years learning to counter Kethvar individual strength and competitive tactics. They had not prepared for cooperative resistance. The first engagement began at 1542 Greenwich Mean with a probe attack on the human vessel Cooperation, a frigate that had been retrofit specifically for joint human-Kethvar operations. The Devourer probe ship expected to face either human tactical responses or Kethvar tactical responses. What it encountered instead was something entirely new, a hybrid defense system that combined human adaptability with Kethvar technological superiority, coordinated through cooperative command structures that allowed for real-time tactical evolution. Captain Maria Santos, commanding the Cooperation, later described the engagement. They came at us with counter-tactics designed to neutralize traditional Kethvar responses, but we weren't fighting like traditional Kethvar. When they adapted to counter our technological advantages, we shifted to human-style improvisation. When they adapted to counter our improvisation, our Kethvar partners shifted to tactical approaches their own species had never used before, cooperative strategies they'd learned from us. The probe ship was destroyed within 17 minutes, but not before transmitting detailed tactical data back to the main Devourer collective. What that data revealed sent shockwaves through the Devourer network that had been confident in their impending victory. The Kethvar were no longer fighting like Kethvar. Dr. Michael Torres, monitoring psychological patterns within the Kethvar population during the engagement, noted unprecedented changes in their stress responses. In previous battles with the Devourers, Kethvar individuals showed classic predator stress patterns, elevated individual survival instincts, reduced cognitive function under pressure, increased aggression combined with decreased tactical flexibility. But fighting cooperatively, their stress responses looked completely different. They were calmer, more focused, and showed improved cognitive function under pressure. Cooperation hadn't just changed their tactics, it had changed their basic neurological responses to combat. The main Devourer assault began at 2:17 GMT the following day. 16 Devourer vessels, each one larger than the biggest Kethvar ship, emerged from what could only be described as dimensional folds in space. Their approach was methodical, designed to isolate and destroy the Kethvar fleet piece by piece, preventing the kind of coordinated resistance that had characterized successful battles against other Devourer prey. But the combined human Kethvar fleet didn't respond, according to any tactical doctrine the Devourers had encountered before. Instead of attempting to match the Devourers' superior firepower or trying to outmaneuver their advanced positioning systems, the fleet did something unprecedented. They began talking to each other, not just tactical communications, emotional support, encouragement, shared resources, coordinated decision-making that included input from every vessel regardless of size or armament. The Devourers, who had built their entire strategic approach on exploiting the isolation and competitive individualism of their prey, found themselves facing an enemy that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians for generations. The human Kethvar fleet was outgunned, outnumbered, and fighting with technology that was individually inferior to their opponents. By every conventional measure, they should have been destroyed within the first hour of engagement. Instead, they began winning. The turning point came when the Devourer flagship attempted to use their signature weapon, a psychological warfare system that had proven devastatingly effective against Kethvar forces in previous engagements. The weapon worked by amplifying competitive instincts and individual survival drives, turning coordinated forces against themselves in a cascade of betrayal and abandonment. Against traditional Kethvar forces, The weapon had been horrifyingly effective. Entire fleets had turned on themselves rather than face Devourer annihilation. But when the weapon was deployed against the cooperative human Kethvar fleet, something unprecedented occurred. The weapon backfired. Dr. Elena Vasquez, analyzing the battlefield communications during the weapon deployment, recorded what became known as the cooperative cascade. The psychological weapon tried to amplify individual survival instincts, but the human Kethvar crews had spent months training themselves to find security in cooperation rather than competition. When their individual survival instincts were amplified, their response was to cooperate more intensively, not less. The weapon that was designed to tear them apart instead bonded them together more strongly than ever before. The result was devastating for the Devourer forces. Ships that had expected to face scattered, panicking enemies found themselves confronting opponents who fought with unprecedented coordination, who shared resources freely even under fire, who risked themselves for allies without hesitation or calculation. But the most profound moment of the battle came when the Kethvar vessel Truthseeker suffered catastrophic damage and began losing life support. In traditional Kethvar doctrine, the ship would have been abandoned, with surviving crew evacuated according to rigid hierarchies of value and importance. Instead, every human vessel in the fleet immediately moved to assist, along with all available Kethvar ships. Under heavy fire with Devourer forces pressing their advantage, the combined fleet risked everything to save 347 Kethvar refugees who, by their own cultural standards, were not worth the cost of rescue. The Devourer response was confusion, then tactical errors born of incomprehension. Their entire battle doctrine was based on exploiting the predictable self-interest of their opponents. Faced with enemies who consistently acted against their own immediate survival interests for the benefit of others, the Devourers began making increasingly irrational tactical decisions. Commander Park, coordinating fleet actions from the human flagship, later described the moment when she realized they were winning. The Devourers started making mistakes. Real mistakes. Not tactical adjustments or strategic repositioning, but fundamental errors that no experienced military force should make. They were trying to predict our actions based on self-interest calculations, but our actions were based on group benefit analysis. They couldn't model our behavior because they didn't understand our motivations. The battle ended when the Devourer flagship, attempting to understand the cooperative phenomenon they were witnessing, made a fatal error. They tried to establish a communication link with the human Kethvar fleet in order to analyze their coordination methods. What they found instead was something their collective intelligence had never encountered before. A communication network based not on hierarchical control or collective subsumption, but on voluntary cooperation between independent minds. The exposure to genuine cooperative consciousness proved to be a mimetic virus that spread through the Devourer collective faster than their safety protocols could contain it. Dr. Chen, monitoring the communications breakdown, recorded the final Devourer transmission. Cannot, process, voluntary, cooperation, individual, choice, within, collective, benefit, system failure, we, I, cannot, understand, choice, to, help, others, when, self survives, system failure, failure. The Devourer fleet disengaged at 14:23 Greenwich Mean, their vessels retreating through dimensional folds that sealed behind them. They left behind debris, scattered energy signatures, and most importantly, communication logs that revealed the full scope of what had occurred. The Devourers were not just a military force, they were a collective intelligence that had evolved to consume civilizations by exploiting their inherent competitive weaknesses. They had survived by being very good at predicting and countering the selfish behavior patterns that characterized most spacefaring species. But they had never encountered a species that had learned to be stronger through voluntary weakness, that had developed social structures based on mutual support rather than hierarchical competition. The cooperative consciousness that humanity had taught to the Kethvar was not just tactically effective. It was fundamentally incompatible with the Devourer collective intelligence. In the aftermath of the battle, both species began to understand what they had accomplished. They had not just defended themselves against an existential threat, they had discovered a form of social organization that made them collectively immune to the kind of psychological warfare that had destroyed dozens of other civilizations. But the implications extended far beyond military applications. As the combined fleet began repairs and recovery operations, it became clear that the cooperative principles that had saved them in battle we're also making them more effective at every other aspect of civilization maintenance. Kethvar individuals who had spent months learning human cooperation techniques were not just better soldiers, they were better engineers, better scientists, better leaders. They were healthier, both physically and psychologically. Their birth rates had increased, their suicide rates had decreased, and their overall quality of life had improved dramatically. We came asking you to teach us how to be weak, transmitted Kethvar Fleet Commander Zethara in the official post-battle communication. You taught us instead how to be strong in ways we never imagined possible. We are no longer the beings who fled our homeworld 37 years ago. We are no longer the beings who first contacted you 73 days ago. We are something new, something that could not have existed without both of our species contributing to its creation. The human response, delivered by Commander Park, would become one of the foundational documents of interspecies cooperation. You were never weak, and we never thought you were. You were isolated. We helped you learn that strength shared is strength multiplied, not strength diminished. But we learned too. Watching you adapt, seeing how quickly you embraced cooperation despite millions of years of evolution pushing you toward competition, you've shown us things about the potential of conscious social evolution that we never imagined. As part 2 of this unprecedented story drew to a close, both species faced a new challenge, figuring out what to do with the knowledge they had gained. They had proven that cooperation could triumph over competition, that voluntary weakness could become involuntary strength. The two very different species could not just coexist, but could become something greater than the sum of their parts. But they had also attracted the attention of the galactic community, much of which was about to learn that some of their most fundamental assumptions about civilization, evolution, and survival were about to be challenged by the example of two species who had discovered something entirely new. Part 3. The Transformation of Everything. The news of the Devourer defeat spread through galactic communication networks faster than the science of the time could explain. Within weeks of the battle, delegations from 17 different species had arrived at the human Kethvar fleet's coordinates, each carrying the same basic message: teach us what you have learned. Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as the de facto xenolinguistic coordinator for what had become the largest interspecies gathering in recorded galactic history, later described the scene. Imagine every first contact scenario that human science fiction ever envisioned, then multiply it by 17 and have them all happen simultaneously while you're still trying to figure out the implications of the first one. Species that had been fighting each other for millennia were sitting in the same communication networks, asking for lessons in cooperation from the humans and Kethvar who had somehow made it work. The requests were not academic. Every species that made contact shared variations of the same story. They'd encountered the Devourers or similar collective intelligences and had survived only through luck, superior technology, or temporary alliances that had ultimately collapsed back into competitive individualism. They had watched civilizations fall to enemies that exploited the fundamental assumption that intelligent beings would always prioritize self-interest over group benefit when faced with existential threats. The arrival of the Zephani delegation on day 97 post-battle marked the first real test of whether human Kethvar cooperation principles could be successfully transferred to other species. The Zephani were aquatic beings who had evolved in isolated ocean depths, developing a civilization based on territorial control and resource hoarding. Their social structures were even more rigidly hierarchical than the Kathavar had been, with genetic castes that determined individual worth and social function from birth. Teaching cooperation to the Kathvar was challenging because they were individualistic competitors, reported Dr. Verkiad, Michael Torres, who had expanded his role to become the mission's lead interspecies psychologist. Teaching cooperation to the Zephani was challenging because they weren't even individualistic. They were caste-determined functionalists who couldn't conceive of acting outside their designated social roles. We had to teach them to be individuals before we could teach them to cooperate as equals. The breakthrough came when human psychologists realized that Zephani caste determination, while rigid, was not actually competitive in the same way that Kethvar individualism had been. Instead, it was based on a form of unconscious cooperation, each caste fulfilling its designated function for the benefit of the whole society. The problem was that this cooperation was involuntary and hierarchical, making it vulnerable to the same kinds of exploitation that the Devourers used to turn civilizations against themselves. The solution was revolutionary. Teach the Zephani to make conscious choices about cooperation, to understand that they could fulfill their natural social functions more effectively by choosing to cooperate rather than simply accepting predetermined roles. The first successful Zafani cooperation exercise involved voluntary caste mixing. Individuals from different genetic castes working together on tasks that traditionally would have been assigned to specific castes. The results were immediate and dramatic. Productivity increased, problem-solving capabilities improved, and most significantly, individual Zafani reported higher levels of what could only be translated as life satisfaction. They kept asking us if we were sure it was acceptable for them to feel good about their work, reported Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had expanded her role from child psychology to general interspecies emotional development. Their entire social structure was based on duty and obligation, not fulfillment or personal growth. The concept that work could be both beneficial to the group and enjoyable for the individual was completely foreign to them. By day 120 post-battle, successful cooperation techniques had been developed for 12 different species. Each required modifications based on evolutionary psychology, cultural background, and social organization, but the fundamental principles remained consistent. Voluntary cooperation produced better outcomes than involuntary competition. Shared weakness created collective strength, and conscious choice about social behavior was more effective than unconscious instinct. But the real transformation began when the various species started cooperating with each other, not just learning cooperation principles within their own populations. The Vorthak, silicon-based beings who processed information through crystalline matrices, discovered that their logical processing capabilities were enhanced rather than compromised when they incorporated the emotional decision-making patterns they learned from human cooperation techniques. The Talani, energy beings who had never understood physical resource management, found that cooperation with matter-based species gave them insights into efficiency and conservation that revolutionized their energy utilization. Most surprisingly, the various species began developing hybrid cooperation techniques that none of them could have achieved independently. Human emotional intelligence combined with HFY technological precision and Zafani social organization created problem-solving capabilities that exceeded what any of the individual species had thought possible. Elena Vasquez, now directing the Interspecies Cooperation Institute that had formed organically around the original human HFY cultural exchange, documented these developments. We weren't just teaching species to cooperate within their own populations anymore. We were watching the emergence of genuine interspecies cooperation. Not diplomatic alliances or trade relationships, but actual collaborative consciousness that transcended species boundaries. The implications became clear when the combined species fleet encountered their first major post-devourer crisis, a stellar engineering disaster that threatened to destroy an inhabited system containing 3 billion sentient beings from a species that had not yet developed interstellar travel. The rescue operation required capabilities that no single species possessed: human adaptability and emotional intelligence, HFY technological sophistication, Zafani organizational efficiency, Vorthak computational power, Talani energy manipulation, and specialized capabilities from 8 other species had to be coordinated in real time across distances that made communication delays inevitable. The operation succeeded, but more importantly, it succeeded through a form of cooperative consciousness that none of the participating species had ever experienced before. Decisions were made collectively but instantaneously, with each species contributing their strengths while compensating for each other's limitations, creating an emergent intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts while still preserving the individual identity and autonomy of each participant. "We saved 3 billion beings," reported Commander Park, now serving as the human representative to the Interspecies Cooperation Council. But what we really discovered was that cooperation consciousness could scale beyond anything we'd previously imagined. We weren't just individual species choosing to work together. We had become something new. A genuine interspecies, collective intelligence based on voluntary cooperation rather than involuntary subsumption. The success of the Stellar Rescue Operation marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Cooperation Revolution. Species throughout the galaxy began requesting membership in what was now being called the Cooperative Alliance, not a political organization or military pact, but a voluntary association of species committed to the principles of conscious cooperation and mutual support. But the revolution was not without its challenges. The hierarchy of strength, a political alliance of species that had built their civilizations on competitive dominance, viewed the Cooperative Alliance as a threat to the natural order of galactic civilization. They argued that cooperation was an evolutionary dead end, that species which abandoned competitive strength would inevitably be conquered by those who maintained it. The philosophical debate that resulted would reshape galactic civilization. Dr. Torres, now serving as the Cooperative Alliance's lead theorist on evolutionary psychology, articulated the Alliance's position. The hierarchy assumes that competition is the natural state and cooperation is an aberration that must inevitably fail. But our experience suggests the opposite. Competition is a transitional phase in the evolution of consciousness. Species that learn conscious cooperation don't become weak. They become strong in ways that competitive species can't counter or even understand. The hierarchy's response, delivered by their spokesman, High Commander Vractor of the Dominion species, was uncompromising. Cooperation is the philosophy of the weak, disguised as wisdom to make surrender seem noble. You have defeated one enemy through lucky adaptation to their specific weaknesses. You have not proven that cooperation can triumph over strength systematically applied. The challenge was formal and direct. The hierarchy would test cooperative alliance principles through a series of controlled conflicts designed to prove that cooperation could not triumph over properly applied competitive force. The cooperative alliance's response surprised everyone, including many of its own members. They accepted the challenge, but proposed a modification. Instead of competitive conflict designed to prove superiority, they suggested cooperative challenges designed to demonstrate capability. "We don't need to prove we can defeat you," transmitted Alliance spokesperson, the Kethvar philosopher Zithara, who had become one of the foremost theorists of cooperative consciousness. "We propose instead that we prove cooperation can solve problems that competition cannot address. Let us work together on challenges that require both competitive excellence and cooperative wisdom." The hierarchy's initial response was dismissive, but they agreed to the modified challenge format, confident that any problem-solving competition would ultimately favor species with superior individual capabilities and competitive drive. The challenges that resulted became the foundation of modern galactic civilization. The first challenge was presented by the hierarchy. Construct a defensive network capable of protecting a solar system from Devourer-class threats, using only the resources available within that system, within a time limit that would represent the average warning time available before a Devourer attack. The hierarchy's approach was methodical and impressive. They designed a network of automated defensive platforms with overlapping fields of fire, powered by solar collection systems and controlled by artificial intelligences based on competitive tactical doctrine. Their system was elegant, efficient, and would have been devastatingly effective against any conventional attack. The Cooperative Alliance's approach was radically different. Instead of building a defensive network, they created a cooperative consciousness network that included every sentient being in the system, not just the spacefaring species, but the planet-bound civilizations, the artificial intelligences, even the ecosystem managers and weather control systems. Their defense was a form of distributed intelligence that could adapt to any threat by incorporating it into the cooperative framework rather than trying to destroy it. When the test attack was launched, a simulated Devourer assault using the known tactical patterns of the defeated collective, the results were dramatic. The hierarchy's defensive network performed exactly as designed, repelling the attack with minimal losses and maximum efficiency. The Cooperative Alliance's system did something unprecedented. It converted the attack into a cooperative exercise, turning the simulated Devourers into participants in the system's defensive capabilities. "They didn't defeat the attack," reported the neutral observers from the Galactic Mediation Council. "They incorporated it." The attacking forces became part of the defensive system. "We're not sure this is even theoretically possible, but we observed it happening." The second challenge was presented by the Cooperative Alliance: develop a solution to the resource depletion crisis affecting the Outer Rim territories, where 17 systems were facing civilizational collapse due to resource exhaustion and environmental degradation. The hierarchy's approach was characteristically direct. Identify the systems with the highest resource potential and the strongest populations, evacuate valuable individuals and materials to those systems, and allow the remainder to collapse naturally. It was efficient, practical, and would have saved the maximum number of lives with the minimum expenditure of resources. The Cooperative Alliance's approach was to create resource-sharing networks that would allow the 17 systems to support each other, combining the resource surpluses of some systems with the resource needs of others, while developing new resource generation techniques that could only work through interstellar cooperation. The results exceeded all expectations. Not only did the Cooperative Alliance save all 17 systems, but the resource-sharing networks they created actually increased the total resource availability across the region. Systems that had been facing collapse became net resource exporters within 2 years of implementing cooperative resource management. But the most significant result was unexpected. The hierarchy systems that observed the resource-sharing networks began voluntarily adopting cooperative techniques within their own territories. High Commander Vraktor's final statement marked the end of the challenges and the beginning of a new era in galactic civilization. We have spent millennia believing that strength came from taking what we needed and defending what we had taken. You have proven that strength can come from sharing what we have and helping others share what they have. This is not weakness disguised as strength. This is a form of strength we did not know existed. The integration of the hierarchy species into the Cooperative Alliance was not immediate or simple, but it was irreversible. Species that had built their entire civilizations on competitive dominance found themselves discovering that cooperation enhanced rather than diminished their natural capabilities. Within 5 years of first contact between humans and HFY, the Cooperative Alliance included 43 species from across the galaxy. Within 10 years, that number had grown to over 200. The principles that had begun as a desperate attempt to save a dying HFY refugee fleet had become the foundation of galactic civilization. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity itself. The species that had taught cooperation to the galaxy had learned that their greatest strength lay not in their technology, their military capabilities, or their individual intelligence, but in their instinctive understanding that helping others made themselves stronger. Dr. Sarah Chan, now serving as the first human director of the Galactic Cooperation Institute, reflected on the transformation in her final report. We thought we were teaching aliens how to be more like humans. What we discovered instead was that cooperation is not a human characteristic. It's a universal principle that becomes available to any species willing to choose conscious vulnerability over unconscious strength. We didn't make the galaxy more human. We helped the galaxy, including humanity, become more than any of us could have been alone. The story that began with a desperate plea for help from a dying alien civilization had become the foundation of a new form of consciousness that spans species, planets, and star systems. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes individually invulnerable, but because he learns to find strength in conscious weakness, power in voluntary vulnerability, and victory in choosing to help others succeed. When the HFY had asked for help, humanity's response had indeed changed everything. But what it had changed was not just the fate of 2 species. It was the fundamental understanding of what it meant to be conscious, intelligent, and alive in a universe that rewarded cooperation more than competition, voluntary weakness more than involuntary strength, and shared consciousness more than individual dominance. The galaxy had learned to be strong by learning to be weak together, and in that transformation, every species had discovered that they could be more than they had ever imagined possible. The universe itself had become cooperative,